We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Gary, find your hair, be president.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothe-kushel.
All right, it is Monday, September 9th, and we've since the last time we recorded, Jeremy, we've had the Democratic National Convention take place. We've had the official endorsement and rolling into the Trump campaign of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the launching of the MAHA campaign, Make America Healthy Again, and all that comes with that. And we've had a very interesting, I think, telling indictment of Tenet Media and these figures that we'll talk about going forward, including Tim Pool and Dave Rubin and Russian money and advancing and pushing culture war narratives. We'll get into this, and then this week tomorrow night we've got the first presidential debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and then on Wednesday we have the 23rd anniversary of September 11th. So we've got quite a few things to talk about, and let's get into it. Well, I guess we'll start. We'll give a bit of we'll go in a bit of a chronological element, and also tying everything from the DNC and the Make America Healthy Again campaign to this indictment and some of the things we've got to look forward to going forward, and what this indictment says both about domestic and geopolitical, I think, influence operations with figures such as Tim Pool and Dave Rubin and and Benny Johnson and some of the things affiliated with this financially and otherwise. So we'll tie all of these. We'll try to tie all of these things together and just talk a bit about each of these things over the next hour and 15 minutes or so.
Yes, and so starting with the DNC. I think one of the main bad fruits is now, I think, showing up. The fruit is ripening. The bad fruit is ripening right now as it is becoming clear that any hope for some kind of hostage release ceasefire deal between the Netanyahu regime and Hamas is now being said to be almost zero chance. At the same time, we have the announced escalation potentially, or the prepping for an escalation in the north and southern Lebanon and between Israeli military and Hezbollah. Now we will see whether that actually begins to escalate, as we have still not seen any overt response from Iran that was being held on to for a long time, it looks like. And part of this is the result, obviously, of the Biden-Harris administration's backing of Netanyahu and the ongoing genocide. Now, there were little limitations. There were little bits of publicly leaked disagreements and all of that. But as we were concerned about, both in terms of the incoming Biden-Harris administration, but also when Biden immediately went to Israel and bear-hugged Netanyahu while also embracing the Israel's 9/11 mythology, let's say, at the very least symbology, that there was a major Israeli and Zionist Achilles heel in terms of this administration. Most obvious with all these elements that had come via West exec advisors and this closeness to power of the executive branch, and how many of their people, including this was of Blinken's operation to some extent, were deeply tied in working with Israeli military intelligence, corporate front companies, cyber, AI, and now we have now seen the result of that. Some of those AI systems have been deployed in relationship to the Gaza genocide and the so-called targeting. They seem to be targeting families for, so at the very least, you can say there's been a partial familial genocide at the same time as what I've said from the beginning is that this was part of the decades-long attempted national genocide of Palestine and the Palestinian people by the Israeli regime. And so that is basically was all signaled at the DNC when these very almost supplicant, I would say, but definitely of good faith Democratic Party, Harris campaign supporting folks, including aspects of the uncommitted movement of primary voters who, made a red line in relationship to the Gaza genocide and the Biden-Harris support for it, that they weren't even able to get a Palestinian American elected official. There were many different suggestions they given to the DNC and the Harris campaign to feature at the DNC, and not a single Palestinian voice was heard on the stage, whereas there was a voice given to Israeli hostages, the families of Israeli hostages. Now, it was actually one of the families that supported Palestinian voices to also be given a voice on the stage at the DNC. And none of this worked in terms of the politics of all of this. So this is a major, major moral stain, obviously, at the very least. It's also a major national security issue, obviously, with where Netanyahu goes with all of this. And I'll just point out that a lot of what's been beginning to come to public knowledge and fruition about how cynical Netanyahu's politics really are, even within an Israeli framework where there's not much public support for Palestinian human rights and dignity, definitely not in any organized scale. And even the major protests that have begun to escalate in Israel against Netanyahu are primarily very self-interested in terms of Israeli politics and hostage families and concern about where the isolation of the Israeli system in the world, how they are beginning to look on the international stage, where this so-called war is heading, all of those kinds of things. Meanwhile, I'm reminded of what about 2 decades ago, as Netanyahu was trying to come back in after his first go around as prime minister in the early years of the 21st century, when Sarah Netanyahu was quoted saying that Netanyahu was more important, that her husband was more important than the country of Israel as a statesman, and that if the people of Israel failed to support him and put him back in, then they would likely leave the country and watch it burn down. Basically, leave it to burn. So Sarah Netanyahu eventually had to apologize for making these statements and all of that. And so
that's a pretty, and I know Netanyahu, obviously he's actually He can actually present himself in public, as a respectable politician, polish and all of this. But that's a very Trump-like sounding thing for Sarah Netanyahu to say there. I mean, it shows that maybe there is something deeper within the psyche that maybe isn't analyzed as much because he's very, very, anti-Trump in terms of how he conducts himself in public and all of this. But that's quite a statement of like, yeah, this whole place is going to be destroyed if baby's not put back in.
Well, and it's beyond Trump. It's almost like a proto-ultra Trump in many ways. As we were pointing out from the very beginning after the 11/9 operation, that the entire Trump operation was very Netanyahu. Because we haven't even ever heard Trump say, or his family really say anything like that, we'll leave the country and watch it burn. It's more the threats of, well, the country will burn if you don't elect me. Now, where they were going to go, where Sarah Netanyahu was threatening they were going to leave to, was never followed up on. But now, as we have these, current this current indictment about once again, a very Russian-Israeli axis of some sort that is working on the twin pillars of the 11/9 operation ongoing, which is one was obviously to support the Netanyahu Putin long-term asset Donald Trump to get into office, but also to destabilize in the manner that I like to call the clean break culture war via assault on the American body politic and our sense-making capacity and our ability to ascertain the factual reality of our moment. So I think that now that begins to come more into focus. And as we were pointing out, soon after October 7th, that there were these very glaring facts about Netanyahu's regime's support of Hamas on the surface as a political tool or an anti-political tool to avoid any political conversation, solution to the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict, but also how this was very much tied in. As much attention was given to the Iran connection to Hamas, there was this very, very serious, especially there was an escalation in the year before the October 7th attacks, which I will point out again, happened on Putin's birthday, just like George W. Bush's announcing of the kinetic so-called response to the 9/11 attacks. October 7th of 2001, George W. Bush announces the launching of the kinetic move into Afghanistan.
He was looking into Putin's eyes and saw his soul, I guess, on that day.
Yes, right. So there's these questions are beginning to build. Now, the similar kind of format, and we'll get to this a little bit later after we finish up talking about the DNC, RFK Jr., MAHA, MAGA. There's an upcoming event called Rescue the Republic, which is sort of like a replication and escalation of the Rage Against the War Machine rally. And actually, they're doing on the same weekend at the end of September. It's sort of, once again, the head of the Mises, what I call the Mises Caucus, who are the heads of the Libertarian Party, Angela McArdle at this point, are leading the way toward a Rage Against the War Machine 2.0. And then they're tacking on a way to bring in the new, fresh RFK Jr. Type supporters, what they're calling the unity party between MAHA and MAGA, with someone like Bret Weinstein as a front figure for this. And so they're having a package deal. at the end of the month, and Bret Weinstein is sounding like this is, it sounded like Alex Jones, basically, almost. This is the last chance to save the republic, rescue the republic from the deep state, the uniparty. So it's the the unity party versus the monolithic deep state conspiracy, or the uniparty, right? So this is the setup here, and as we'll discuss, the similar kind of way that the 11/9 operation was covered up on both sides, let's say, of this Putin Netanyahu axis part of it, was there are those who will say this is all Israeli, and any of this Russian stuff is just some kind of front, or it's an avoidance of all of the people that are overtly owned by Israel and the Zionists and the Jewish power syndicate. And then there are those who will attempt to blind folks to the fact that this network, this Tim Pool to Dave Rubin, that ties into the Blaze Media and Glenn Beck and Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA, is also a very Israeli network, right? So we're going to see a very similar kind of structural setup that we have been, I think, very accurately assessing via not, NSA potential wiretaps, or FBI wiretaps, or, ability to see secret Discord servers, but full open source intelligence. And we have had this largely nailed down for at least 5 years, I would say, and sort of developing and evolving sense-making capacity in relationship to what all is going on here. So, but the DNC, they really, this continues to be their Achilles heel, I think, the question of Israel-Palestine, and their deep support for this ongoing genocide, and their very milquetoast and weak who's the GD superpower question coming up here, in terms of there's all this, public statements about how we need a deal, and yet we're not getting a deal.
Right. And so then literally the day after the DNC and I know there have been rumblings about it for a few days, but it was the day after the DNC, on the Friday, right after Harris's speech. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. formally, officially endorses Trump at a rally in Arizona, and they appeared together to, RFK Jr. coming out to the song "There Goes My Hero," and watch him as he goes, and and all the spectacle and pageantry surrounding that, and so, but there's a lot at play here, because I think that RFK Jr. being brought into the Trump ticket, and of course we know all about Kennedy's flaws have been well established. I mean, there's no need to repeat all those here. I mean, certainly they figure into our conversations, but his flaws have been well established. But also there are things there that are within, if not the personal philosophy of Kennedy himself, certainly within a bigger element of a fusion blend of some of the things he's personally been involved with over the years, and then also people who may be more inclined to support a campaign like that for various reasons, of actual serious legitimate policy proposals and potential solutions that have been, if not downplayed, if not ignored and shunned, and even ridiculed outright by the DNC, by the Democratic Party apparatus. And obviously, I think Israel's one area, like the lack of Palestinian presence. That's an area where you could have capitalized on, because obviously Kennedy is seen as being a hawk on Israel and Zionism, to the right of, I think, most American Democrats, even within government, within Congress, et cetera. But there's an opening there, that a void there, or at the very least, it becomes people who are disenchanted with both, say, like the Democrats, but then also don't look at Kennedy as certainly Trump Kennedy types as positive for anything positive to come out of as it for the Palestinians. Still, then it becomes a matter of, well, neither of these sides are doing anything for me. And so then it either becomes like more apathy, we're going to sit this thing out, or else there will be some who will be inclined maybe to go more in the direction of a Kennedy for precisely some of these other reasons that that there's been a refusal to deal with, or even just like a public ridicule of, a public dismissal of, when it surrounds things like questions of science around COVID lockdowns or vaccines. And obviously, as we've talked about so many times on here before, for years, there's been a void being filled by people that come in to fill narrative voids with good information, but then also with some good information, but then also comes with some very problematic elements within whatever decent information's there. I mean, that seems to always be the case. And now I think it's now really with Kennedy openly embracing Trump and this element of, not just not filling in a void on Israel-Palestine that Kennedy's actually very weak on when it comes to, say, peace movements and anti-war movements, but then also things around science of things around as it relates to vaccine science, medical science, lockdown science, and then also as it relates to even elements of environmental policy that a Kennedy could be very strong on and that he's kind of made his bread and butter on as far as his public political advocacy. Then you lose that. And at the very least, once again, I think this has been a glaring weakness that has been there for a long time. And now I think with Kennedy getting behind Trump formally, and I believe mentioned, Jeremy, there was an outreach to both parties, I believe, right?
By RFK Jr., you're saying?
By RFK Jr., yes.
Yeah. And so that was supposedly there had been an approach to the Harris campaign specifically for some kind of alliance there by RFK Jr. Now, some of this seems to get rewritten a little bit after the fact in the way that RFK Jr. tells how this emergent relationship with Trump actually happened, and so the timeline gets a little bit confused. But it sounds like he first approached Harris, and then when was totally rebuffed, then he became open to Trump's advances. Now, meanwhile, people might want to go back and to our episode. I don't know. It was probably a year and a half ago, maybe, or something like that, in terms of the emergence of the RFK Jr. campaign, where there were lots of factual indicators that this was some kind of Trumpoid operation. It looked like it was being backed by the Roger Stone and Steve Bannon types, and oh wow, magically here we are. It basically, there he is, RFK Jr. coming on stage with Trump and basically telling his entire support base to vote for Trump in states where it, quote unquote, would matter, while continuing to vote for RFK Jr. to build the movement in states where it might not matter electorally. So, a lot of the indicators were there to see that this was actually what was going to happen with this campaign, and now it has emerged. Now, that doesn't negate the massive, I think, very destructive failure of the DNC and Harris campaign, especially, to, at the very least, open up a conversation with the RFK Jr. supporters of good faith that includes all of the reasons that you gave. But what's interesting is if people really want to understand why someone like RFK Jr. actually might be a very valuable asset in an executive branch. Now, I think he's totally disqualified from actually trying to be commander-in-chief for a lot of different reasons, including very serious questions about his history, potential personal compromise, but also Russian-Israeli axis questions in terms of foreign policy and war and peace. And all of that. He ends up looking like he's sort of like on the wrong side of both Israel, Palestine, and Russia, Ukraine. in a way that this entire network of influencers seem to often be on the wrong side of both, but sometimes just maybe on the wrong side of one, I would say, in terms of the question of defense and what is the aggressive quote unquote war being perpetrated. But if people really want to understand like what the capacity and the experience that RFK Jr. actually has in terms of really important policy, big policy that needs to happen in a way that fits in with the American system, I would say too, then they should actually go listen to RFK Jr.'s podcast with on Ben Shapiro's show, actually, where there is some discussion about Russia and Ukraine, but RFK Jr. actually sort of takes advantage of the platform in a way that Shapiro seems a little bit uncomfortable with, at least in terms of the use of time, to actually go over his background and his policy proposals for how to begin to solve some of these major, MAHA kind of issues, make America healthy again. I'm not sure we were ever quite all the way healthy, but I think that you can make a better case that America was once healthier than America was great, and now we need to make America great again. As I pointed out, we need to make America good, and from there we then could make America healthy again, and then make America great if we were so desiring. But it's there that you begin to hear the way that RFK Jr. would use. Very interesting, and now in terms of who he's teamed up with, the administrative state, in a way that uses even what you might call lawfare in terms of these massive corrupt corporations, especially in things like big agro, when you're thinking about Monsanto and the massive glyphosate poisoning of the country through lots of different food networks and all of that, but then also how he would take on big pharma in a way that would be all based on the intersection of science and law, right? And so and using civil suits, using civil law. And remember, this is like the whole, if there's the whole sort of right aspect of the culture war for decades, has been about the questions of abortion and women's reproductive rights. The whole libertarian economic strain of the right has often been about tort reform and how these lawyers are getting out of hand with their attacks on corporations and making business too difficult to do. But if you listen to RFK Jr. lay out both his background in terms of how he was able to help salvage the water health and safety of the Hudson, for example, how he was able to take on certain big pharma vaccine manufacturers and other ecological polluters. He basically is proposing something that I think would work very, very well, and it would be very much in the tradition of the best of the American public system and the function of government to referee the free market, right? And this has always been, my political philosophical concept is this idea of the hierarchy of sovereignty, and that this is what the American system has promised, is that we, the people, and that's the actual private sector, we are at the top of the chain in terms of we then delegate certain rights and responsibilities to the government. That's the public sector. And then the public sector, as we know from Delaware corporations and the history, more than 150-year history of the birth of corporations in an American context, that corporations are given their charter they only have rights and responsibilities in relationship to a functioning public sector, states specifically, but also the federal the federal government. And then, of course, underlying this entire hierarchy of sovereignty is the question of the commons and the protection of the commons, and hopefully the rejuvenation and the growing of the health of the commons. And that includes the invisible commons, which is then when you're talking about information flow, health resources, legal resources, and all that. Language even is part of the invisible commons. But then the very physical commons that every human being who's being honest knows that if you don't have air that's clean enough to breathe, water that's clean enough to drink, food that's clean enough to eat, if you polluted all of these ecological commons, then there's no hope for maybe even life itself, let alone healthful life, or a life of wellness and both physical and spiritual abundance. So this is the area where obviously, like this is where I would go with the corporate uniparty question. Is the DNC is a total quote unquote failure in relationship to not really stepping into the nature of the overlapping crises that are escalating, and that includes the ecological crises that include all of these domains of water, food in terms of soil, but also air in terms of the what is looking like an escalating ecological catastrophe in terms of climate crisis in all its different parameters and generators and sources and all of that. And so there are a whole bunch of escalating catastrophes here that are global in their potential outcomes that are, at the very least, you can see that the DNC and the Harris campaign are not up to the intensity of the moment. Now, they still to me look like, in that case, they are at least not in full denial of the extent of these crises, like the RNC was, with their sort of emphasis on both skewing the actual facts in terms of, we're talking about how the Biden administration is sort of an enemy of fossil fuels or depletable fuels and all that, whereas it's not true. That's actually not true. They've been facilitated. There's actually been a growth in that sector under Biden-Harris, but also in total denial of any kind of significant overlapping ecological catastrophe of any sort in terms of drill baby drill, to no mention of any of this health stuff in the RNC until after the DNC. Now Trump is, bringing RFK Jr. on stage to make America healthy again. Now, the last thing I'll say on this is that it may be the case that it's illegal to actually offer a cabinet position in exchange for an endorsement, for example. So that it looks like, so that it may be that it was not actually legal within electoral laws for the Harris campaign to engage in a quote unquote quid pro quo kind of conversation with RFK Jr. and his base in terms of cabinet positions. And it may be also why they're being very careful on the Trump side of things to not announce what role RFK Jr. will be playing, quote unquote, in exchange for his now endorsement of Trump. But in finishing that up, I'll just say that this once again emphasizes, I think, the importance of the strategy that I've put forth, which is a We the People's platform and a coalition cabinet. That's the way you actually do independent politics. Is you don't start a new party, you do transpartisan organizing, And out of the gate, you create a coalition that begins to have a conversation based on some of these very vital issues and a limited but substantial, maybe I propose a 7 part platform to deal with sort of most all of the substantial issues in a way that's a coalition. And so that you bring in different ideologies, you bring in different political perspectives and commitments and different kinds of areas of expertise from the very beginning. And then people actually know what they're voting for, both in terms of platform and in terms of a cabinet, and in rather than sort of just this sort of emphasis on the single executive president that we're going to vote for, and then don't worry that everything else will come from that. So now we've just seen a little bit more explication of the Harris policy platform, which is said to be looking, you know, uh, not woke and, fairly pragmatic in certain ways and all of that. But these kinds of questions should be what starts a campaign, not what ends a campaign. And so putting aside all of these questions of deep politics and haggling, I think it really points to the importance of us actually figuring out how to do independent, I would say radical independent politics in the United States in a way that brings people together rather than these highly weaponized kind of last minute negotiations, allegedly, that then put someone like Trump and RFK Jr. on the stage together. I mean, that almost looks worse than like what Vance, what Trump's VP candidate had said about Trump earlier in terms of what RFK Jr. had said about Trump earlier, because it actually read a little bit more grounded in terms of why RFK Jr. said he would never support Trump.
Good points. And I think that from my vantage point, after a month or so of just really of the optimism and excitement in a lot of circles that surrounded Biden dropping out and Harris coming in and bringing in Tim Walz, who we talked about in our previous show about our reasons for, I guess, what we call maybe guarded, cautious optimism regarding the prospect of Tim Walz as the VP and what some of the potential positives that could be brought forth by this ticket. Then I think this Kennedy endorsement and this unveiling of this campaign, I feel like it's, maybe to say it's given the Trump campaign another lifeline. I don't know if that's exactly accurate, but certainly I think has negated a good portion of that momentum, I think. And it's not to say it's all gone or anything, of course, but I think that it has negated a lot of that momentum. And so in thinking about this and just going back to what we were talking about before with the void that's being filled here. And it's interesting now because all of the potential positives that RFK brings to the table, in addition to all of the problems, of course. So, we don't need to get into all that again, but now it's basically been brought into all of these things. It's interesting because you go back to 2016 and where was Trump's strength was seen as being around addressing issues that, the Democratic, the bipartisan, the uniparty would not address, like issues surrounding maybe people's concerns about free trade and the effect that that's had on infrastructure, on domestic jobs, and on certain job markets and certain elements of industry, and then also, of course, obviously the questions of foreign policy and all of this, which obviously were very weaponized in a very, I think, ultimately counterproductive way, fitting right into this clean break culture war. So that was 2016, but now on top of that, now we're into 2024 now, and the culture war has really been taken to the next level with this, war on wokeness and the whole issue of school boards and wanting to turn the kids into the boys, all this stuff that goes with the anti-trans, anti-wokeism, And then also on top of that, now you've got Kennedy bringing in not just issues of trade and elements of economic policy and elements of anti foreign policy that have been exploited, I would say, by the first Trump campaign, but now also bringing in like actual elements of what could be considered a democratic populism around ecological issues, environmental issues, health issues, science issues. And of course, those have always been there with regards to like elements of the libertarian and paleo conservative right, certainly the more conspiracy culture friendly right with questions around science of vaccines. But it's obviously been much more, it's much more prevalent now, of course, post 11/9, post COVID America, and all that we've seen play out there. So it's now even where I think all of these issues that are legitimate are pretty much, and of course there's areas where obviously I think that both Harris and Walz are positive. We talked about that in terms of the positives, potential certain positives as far as elements of domestic policy and reasons at the very least why the foreign policy is certainly not on the level of what we're going to get from MAGA 2.0, but even outside of those, there's areas that are still even like, Tim Walz, where obviously he's very weak around these issues of science and maybe not seen as proficient enough or sufficient enough for a lot of people on elements of environmental policy that you could have a Kennedy bring in, but instead it's been brought right into coup 2.0, right into the overthrow the system J6 2.0, basically MAGA 2.0, and so now all of these areas that are, I think, that are important to the Kennedy people and to other people who are inclined to think this way, who have been disenchanted with Democrats for a long time, and who, while Harris and Walz are probably better than what we've had in the past, they're still not sufficient enough. Areas that they care about that are important are being entirely exploited and brought right back into this. Right into the hands of the seditious coup plotters, basically. And also, on one more point I will throw in there to finish that out is I don't know where this is ultimately going to go. Like, you'd have to think there'd be a clash between elements of, if not Kennedy himself, and certainly elements of his base who very much care about these environmental and ecological issues and issues as it relates to, say, that you would maybe want to have like a relatively strong administrative state to deal with and help handle and bring a solution to. There's going to be, I think, a day of reckoning and probably a clash with these forces who have been proven long track record to not just not care about any of that stuff, but be directed and openly hostile to it. But as for right now, at the very least, like, they've been brought in almost entirely into this fold of MAGA 2.0 and just overthrowing the government and basically destroying the system in the name of these combination of domestic and foreign interests that are directly hostile to the American state and the American body politic as we know it for all of its flaws. They don't want to actually make it better. They want to actually just destroy it. And so, I think the long-term sins and problems of democratic uniparty, you could call it, policy, I think really do come to roost in a moment like the complete bringing together of not just Trump with the economic elements and the anti-war, but even now with these other issues that say Kennedy, or at least people affiliated with Kennedy that support him and support policies that he's putting out there. Now they're just about completely in this whole Trump axis, and then you bring in the libertarians and this. It's Rescue the Republic, correct? So Rescue the Republic rally, and so many forces come together. We were talking about like the bridging of different movements and different people. Now I think it's more prevalent than ever in terms of just the sheer amount of types of like movements and interests that have been brought in, some more directly than others, into this what we now call MAGA 2.0. And to say it's a missed opportunity would be an understatement, because even if Kennedy, I don't know how serious he would be about endorsing the Democrats in this moment in time for a lot of reasons, but at the very least, you can have dialogue and conversation and show that you're concerned about some of these issues that are serious, that do need to be dealt with, rather than just dismissing it outright as this is all kookery.
Exactly. And so, it's similar in terms of Israel-Palestine. It's so obvious that, as in one way, where Trump just recently said to market, it sounds like, to his intense Adelson funded and Christian Zionist base to some extent that are still behind him, who are not faltering in their support for him, like some of the new alt-right is, in terms of Fuentes and the Groypers and other elements of the sort of right influencer community, who are way more questioning and suspicious of Jewish power and Israel and Zionism and stuff like that. So Trump basically almost gave this sort of dissident sect within his former base of like the Groypers and stuff, almost a marketing piece for Harris, where he said, if Harris gets elected, Israel will be gone. And so they're like, even someone like Sneeko, a recent adherent to the JQ-JP issue and all of that kind of thing, is, well, that sounds like a good endorsement for Harris. And meanwhile, Trump is marketing hard to this Christian Zionist Adelson-funded base, too, at the same time, of basically saying Israel will be destroyed if Harris gets in. It's not going to be because of the Netanyahus who will flee the country and let it burn to the ground. No, it couldn't be that. He wouldn't say that kind of thing, although some of his supporters will say, well, he thinks that. We'll find out that that's what he thinks if he gets back in there. When he really takes on Netanyahu, because Netanyahu didn't support what he's sort of now admitted. Trump has now admitted that he lost by a hair in 2020, and that was sort of the big piece of his Trump's anger toward Netanyahu, is that Netanyahu eventually endorsed or sort of congratulated the incoming Biden administration. And as we pointed out, that whole thing has been totally frauded up too. And that it was the Israelis held on for a long time, actually. They were not the first in the world to congratulate Biden. They were actually way down there. And the actual congratulation, the acknowledgement that Biden had won, was definitely not first. It was more in the middle of the pack. It was sort of late. It was definitely after a bunch of actual allies of the United States in terms of that. But the actual call from Netanyahu to Biden was almost a week later. And so especially in terms of now, Trump seems to publicly have even abandoned his the justification for a seditious conspiracy that ended up in January 6th and all of that. That was, Netanyahu was not, as we were saying at the time, like, Netanyahu obviously wanted Trump, was his guy, was his asset in many ways, but he's not going to go all the way to sacrificing his entire relationship with the main Israeli patron still at this point, the United States of America, in order to do it. Okay. So, all right. So you have that. And so there was this major failure. I think you're correct, Greg, in terms of that not only did Harris Walz and the DNC fail to really capitalize on the sort of the moral instincts of their voter base in terms of ending the current form of the Gaza genocide as quickly as possible, that there was this potential there, especially because of like Kennedy and Trump as these uber Zionist hawks, that they missed that opportunity at the same time as actually speaking to this larger coalition that would move beyond their base, that would talk to this general sentiment of Americans, knowing that there's a problem here in terms of our medical system, in terms of our health, in terms of food, and not just the prices, but the quality, and how a lot of, American food is not even seen as fit for animal feed. In Japan, for example, it's not even allowed into Europe, and it's the United States is seen as a dumping ground, really, for low quality food in many ways. And so there was a strong possibility there that, of course, the DNC missed it, obviously. Now, like for Walz actually sort of made maybe the most proactive statement about an actual peaceful, potentially just resolution to the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict in one of his recent interviews, and Harris, in her DNC acceptance speech, did sort of basically just mimicked what had already been said publicly by Biden a month earlier in terms of acknowledging the horror of October 7th attacks, while then spending more time actually on talking about the rights and dignity and rights to self-determination of the Palestinian people. So, but a lot of that in terms of the lack of hard-nosed diplomatic power that the United States under Biden-Harris is refusing to deploy against the Netanyahu regime seems to be too little too late. And it's definitely too little too late for the dozens of thousands, maybe now it's really looking like potentially a few 100,000 casualties of Palestinians in terms of what's going on in Gaza. And then obviously just on the surface, the virtual destruction, total destruction of any infrastructure that would allow the Palestinians in Gaza to, live lives.
Yeah, and this would have been, we've said it before, this would have been an opportunity to really pick up on this, because the political climate, you would think, would be at this level to where it should be by all means. And once again, this goes back to the power that the Israel lobby, both within Congress, economically, financially, influence campaigns has, because this would be the time with all the stuff we've been talking about that's been going on for years, with this growing tension, I think is a safe word to say, between the American bipartisan, whatever terms you want to use, foreign policy consensus, foreign policy community, and and certainly this increasing Likud right wing, obviously the whole influence of Likud and of Netanyahu and of the Uber hawks that have come about, certainly very much coalescing and rising with the overall escalation of the transition from Cold War to global terror war and all that's come with that. This is nothing new. It's been going on for years, at least since the days when President Bush clashed with Yitzhak Shamir, and going on from there. And even before that, obviously, you go back to even the early days of Israel. But in terms of I think of this transition in Israeli society, as far as this move into this terror war hawkishness, certainly that's been going on for quite a while now in areas that it's been directly at odds with American foreign policy goals, with Western foreign policy goals. But you would think now, with not only post 11/9, post installation of Trump by these hostile foreign entities, post 10/7, and obviously once the immediate effects of and the emotional aftermath of 10/7 wore off, you'd think maybe, we'll start to get, and you get rumblings of it, but it's never sufficient enough. And even now, like in a time where this would be a perfect storm to really to do more open moves and steps in the direction of actually really trying to take real steps to try and deal with this problem, whether it would be with the direct problem of Netanyahu, as Charles Schumer pointed out in his in that Senate speech he made several months ago, where he laid out, I think, all the problems and directly named Netanyahu government and the hardliners in the government. But you always get the talk of it, but then once push comes to shove, it seems like it just doesn't really go to where it needs to go. And in a time when Kennedy is being brought in with his obviously hawkishness, this would be a time to really make a move in this regard, and it hasn't been done. That's very unfortunate. And that's not to say that there's still not certainly a lesser evil choice between what we've seen with some potential positive steps, or at the very least the antipathy and the coldness of, say, the Netanyahu gang towards Harris Walz, and towards increasingly towards the Democratic Party in general post post-MAGA, with all of the things that have been going on in terms of the cultural shiftings and cultural attitudes among society, all the things we've talked about for us and others have talked about for a long time. There's an opening and a void there, and it's just not being filled. And then you just add in all these other things. And I just think, Jeremy, think of the potential possibilities if you had some of the policy proposals and some of the things that Tim Walz represents, combined with then some of the positives of this RFK movement. And man, you could really that could really be very dangerous in a potentially positive and productive way. But I think we're beyond getting something like that now.
Yes, and and maybe it's very possible that this was all predetermined, and our early assessment of the RFK Jr. campaign would suggest that this was predetermined. And then also even then after RFK Jr., then you had Tulsi Gabbard taking the obvious, looked like a predetermined move to get in bed and endorse Trump. She even then did a so-called town hall with Trump, so her announcing the questions pretty soon thereafter. And so, we had assessed Tulsi Gabbard as a terror war hawk, pretending to be a dove on quote unquote regime change wars TM for more than 5 years now, I think, really. And of course, the infamous Adelson Shmuley Boteach picture of with Tulsi Gabbard at the Christians United for Israel conference, I think it was, and then very similar kinds of pictures with RFK Jr. Now, I don't think there's an Adelson RFK Jr. Picture. It was with Miriam Adelson rather than the late Sheldon Adelson. But this is a network, and obviously, as we pointed out, that Trump is also, he was a terror war hawk. As much as they like to grandstand upon this idea of no new wars, Trump escalated the actual terror war and the drone wars intensely, even over what Obama had done, which was intensely escalating it over Bush. And so this just sort of proves the lie of the whole, this whole alleged anti-interventionist, Dove regime that, that now we sort of know that there's elements that are being backed by foreign powers that all seem to sort of align in repeating these falsehoods and this obvious propaganda that seems to serve those who are engaging in aggressive warfare, from Netanyahu to Putin.
Jeremy, I had mentioned this to you when I saw this. I had seen a quote from John Bolton that the only mistake that was made with Iraq is that we didn't go in after removing Saddam. We didn't just drop a copy of the Federalist Papers and say, "Here you go. Do what you have to do with this," and so that's very much in different ways. Like Trump, in terms of like, it wasn't about a principled stand against war. No, it was like, go in, get the resources, and get out. And so a lot of the anger, you even hear Tulsi Gabbard. She says regime change wars. Like ultimately, does that mean that there's no indication that that doesn't mean that it doesn't figure, like with the problem that with the whole, when we talk about the neocon split, is a lot of them, they wanted to go into Iraq, and a lot of the most people who were pushing most for the war in Iraq were people that weren't interested in the nation building regime change operation that Tulsi Gabbard says is at the center of our foreign policy evils. No, they wanted to just go in and they weren't. So there's a misunderstanding there where it's always considered, oh yeah, you just want to go in and tell these people how to live and dictate their affairs and build their government for them and do all this. But no, I mean, there was these elements they get this cover for being somehow not being anti-war, when really, no, they were just like, we'll go in and we'll do this and then we'll move on to our next target. It's very frustrating, but ultimately more and more Trump, and then even like Tulsi Gabbard herself, it's like this attitude of go in, get these people out, and then give them Federalist Papers and tell them they can have our republic, and then just do what you have to do with it. I mean, so it's I just think about that because it's very frustrating, because these are not doves when it comes to these things. I think Tulsi increasingly figures into that just as well, because remember her whole big talking point when she was the second top person at the DNC was Obama won't say radical Islamic extremism.
Which in her hosted town hall with Trump, she sort of said it very slowly and very specifically once again to show that she's against Islamo extremist terrorism or something like that, and so there she goes. She's perfectly in bed with Michael Flynn, obviously, as we pointed out from the very beginning of 11/9. Michael Ledeen and Michael Flynn, with their book, The Field of Fight, articulating the importance of the ongoing terror war and all of that. And Flynn, fresh off of his, or maybe not that fresh, but fairly recently at his RT celebration at the table with Putin and Jill Stein, and all of these players are still in the mix. And I think you're right, Greg. We're just sort of facing an escalated version of it on, amphetamines, basically similar to the amphetamines that Trump has apparently been using and abusing for decades. And even there was a speech where it looked like something went flying out of his nose again. And Trump is actually really is showing very public signs of deterioration. He slurred his way through his so-called interview with Lex Friedman on his podcast and all of that. And so the question of Trump's not mental fitness, no, mental danger, I would say, in terms of someone like Bandy Lee, who was kept at bay from testifying to Congress during the Trump years by the Pelosi network, really, in a similar kind of way that the Pelosi network attacked certain deeper truth tellers like Sarah Kendzior and all of that. And so we are still at a moment where the voices of people like that are even more important in many ways, and we're not being given big platforming chances to hear from them. And so this is a very cynical, I think, move. Now, I understand RFK Jr. has made this he's morally wrestled with why he was willing to put aside his independent campaign to some extent. He didn't cancel. He didn't sort of end the campaign. He's suspending the campaign. He's trying to get off the ballots that he was trying to get onto, that he was being, dealing with lawfare by the Democrats in certain states. Now he's having a hard time getting off of the ballot in some of those states where he wants his people to vote for Trump. And, he says that this is the similar kind of Alex Jonesified. They're so concerned about the crisis of the moment, whether it's the fall of the Republic or the rise of World War III, and in ways that are factually often very inaccurate at best, but definitely all weaponized all the way down. That RFK Jr. said, well, these issues of American health and wellness are so important, and they are so important, I would say, but that he was willing to get in bed with Trump and for some kind of, can't even be a promise, because I think of some of the sort of quid pro quo kind of laws against it, but just some quote unquote seat at the table in a very similar fashion to like Angela McArdle of the Libertarian Party, the way that she ran her convention and featured both RFK Jr. and Trump with an alleged sort of, not even a handshake of that there would be a libertarian in the administration, hopefully to end the Department of Education or something like that. But once again, you're dealing with a con man. This is Trump. So I think it's as likely that, that Trump is going to help, if he were to get back in, make America healthy again with the help of RFK Jr. and his movement, as it was that he was actually going to release all of the truth about who killed the Kennedys or who knocked down the towers or these kinds of things that now he's promising, no, this time I'm going to do it. Maybe Epstein, I don't know. There might be some people who are unjustly accused, But so this is sort of the kind of devil's bargain that RFK Jr. is making in this moment, and that includes all throughout these, allegedly former left kind of networks, from Bret Weinstein, the sort of the anti-woke sage of the IDW, which I call them now the Israeli defense web, really, in many ways. If you look at the Weinsteins and Sam Harris and that whole crew, it's pretty obvious in the day and age of the Gaza genocide and still continuing cover up of Netanyahu's very good 9/11 to what they did on October 7th is incredible operations. That this is and then on into like the Jimmy Dore types who are now at the sort of front of the so-called rescue, the Republic operation. Now, I'd say we're entering this transition between summer and fall of this year, heading towards September 11th and all of that. So what we are also seeing indicators of the beginning of the fall of the fake Republic.
Yes, and right before we take our last few minutes to start talking about this this Tenet Media indictment, I just a couple of quick follow-ups on that. One is that and I just think about, you mentioned the whole Department of Education thing and the libertarian Mises Caucus, as you call it, being all in on that, and Michael Tracy dismissing like, oh, Project 2025, oh, it's really Project 1981 and all of this, and but it's in some way, obviously, it's so escalated, but a lot of the same policy goals are still in place. There's actually a more realistic chance of making a lot of these things happen than there were in 1981, considering where we've gone since then. So it's much more going on with, oh, they're just trying their quixotic, insane quests to abolish the Department of Education. No, these things actually potentially have teeth to them now, and it's a much more escalated time, and it's a much different part of even it was, and there's so many things at play here that you still see the tenets of the original, new right elements that did want to destroy the administrative state before it was called the administrative state, like in the way that Steve Bannon has popularized the term, are still there. And so, no, it's not just Project 1981. It's very real, and it's potentially very real damage can be done from that. And I was even thinking about Tulsi, Jeremy, that I think the event may have already happened this weekend. Either that or it's coming soon. Tulsi Gabbard with Tucker Carlson and Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation, and talk about someone who, obviously, Project 2025, well, we know nothing about that, whatever they're saying about that and all that. But obviously, talk about something that is in direct contrast to a lot of the Kennedy policy agenda. It's the Heritage Foundation and Kevin Roberts and Project 2025, which is right there on stage with Tulsi and Tucker Carlson at one of these rallies that Tucker was the series of rallies that Tucker is holding over the next couple of months. I mean, it doesn't get much more of a contrast between Kennedy's, say, his ecological, environmental populism and the Heritage Foundation, to say the least.
No, and that's actually way more likely that with another Trump term that we would see actually the fulfillment of Project 2025 and things like ending the Department of Education and the EPA, for example, rather than actually making America healthy again or finding out who actually killed the Kennedys and all of that. So you're correct in that the actual political dynamics to see the most extreme pieces of the right movement in this country that have been going on for decades. And in many ways, going back to Heritage and Trump's alleged ignorance of that they even exist, I don't even know them. They're just doing these things, all these kinds of things. No, he knows exactly who they are. He knows what Project 2025 is. And this has a long history. Now, Michael Tracy's correct. It does have a long history, but it's actually reaching the political tipping point and at a very extreme pitch in many ways. And and going back, as we sort of, touch briefly on this question of sort of Russian assets, I think we can. It's obvious. It's very clear that Tim Pool is a Russian asset. Whether it was witting or unwitting, he is now officially, at least allegedly, defined as a Russian asset. as is Dave Rubin, as is Lauren Southern, as is all of these
Benny Johnson, a few others as well. Yeah, they were the three most prominent names, I think. Yeah, the most prominent names are the ones you mentioned.
Yeah, and so these are Russian assets. But meanwhile, as you've pointed out, Greg, over the years, that there is this long-term question of the clean break culture war and how it has evolved and escalated and been increasingly weaponized. That where there is this very strong question of Russian relations. And, on the surface, obviously, there's the extreme Likudnik, Israeli Zionist connections there that are not hidden, but a little bit just barely under the surface in a way that is just bubbling up now in terms of some of these indictments. That includes Tenet Media and sort of the sort of tip of the iceberg of $10 million being sloshed around to these pretty major right-wing influencers. But also the indictment of someone like Dimitri Simes and his wife that just happened recently after an FBI raid of their Virginia home. And Simes was at the epicenter of these networks that we've been tracing for many, many years, at the sort of head of the CNI, and how we pointed out that from, the involvement of people like Dov Zakheim to everywhere to Hank Greenberg, Maurice Hank Greenberg, and Henry Kissinger at the epicenter of the CNI, which was at the epicenter of the Trump foreign policy shift on Russia, specifically the infamous Mayflower Hotel public sort of coming out of the very likely Paul Manafort initiated shift of the GOP platform in relationship to very specific Russian interests at the Mayflower Hotel 2016, that a lot of this network is now being uncovered. And now similarly to someone like Max Blumenthal's panel mate, Charles Bausman, in relationship to their RT, galas and all of that. Charles Bausman went running out of the country after January 6th. Apparently, was he involved? I don't know. Dimitri Simes also seemed to go running after the incoming Biden administration and set up shop in relationship to a major, state-oriented Russian TV channel. And so a lot of this is now coming to some kind of legal fruition, partially because of the questions of sanctions, financial sanctions surrounding such things as the Russian TV, RT, state media, and all of that, which is where this Tenet Media indictment is actually about. It's an indictment of two RT Russian operatives who were the ones who were organizing with Lauren Chen and her husband to actually facilitate this Russian front company as a slush fund for clean break culture warriors amongst these right-wing alleged alt media types. And so I'll just say that if you go into it, that basically Margarita Simonian, who we pointed out that although it was very thin and very, there was not enough substance to the intelligence report after the 2016 election. It was a very thin kind of report. There were these quotes from Margarita Simonian in it that pointed out that when Russia went to war, or when Russia was engaged in any kind of war, it seemed to imply even hybrid war, Cold War or information war, that RT is and was an organ of the Russian, security state, obviously, the Russian military-industrial complex, you might even say. And now Simonian has publicly articulated this again on Russian media, that they answer to the Kremlin, and that they have an empire of covert media operations around the world. And the question of covert media operations is posed in this indictment of the Tenet Media principles in terms of these two Russian figures. Now, no one else who is who's described in the indictment has been indicted themselves. Neither Lauren Chen and her husband, nor Tim Pool, Dave Rubin, Lauren Southern, all these types, Benny Johnson. No one has been indicted yet in any of this, and these are still allegations. But what appears to be true on the surface is exactly what we've been saying based on open source intelligence in terms of this, that there is a very major Russian covert information warfare operation that is ongoing, that is there's material backing of it, that it's not just about sort of like sanctions questions or principles of the Ukraine war, but this has to do with a clean break culture war. And I think more and more that my use of that phrase is very correct. And it's sort of like the Syria version of a clean break. It's not necessarily regime change first and foremost, or even the main thrust, or even the outcome of it. It's a destabilization, a rollback. It's a rollback clean break culture war that's going on here. And although Tim Pool is still pretending to be a useful idiot, aka an unwitting Russian asset, and doesn't understand why the Russians would be even interested in him discussing the woke agenda in films and all of that.
Such a
We've been
mystery.
pointing out exactly why the Russians are interested in that, and that includes this access then back from Putin to Netanyahu. And that this is pretty obvious from Lauren Southern and her background with Ezra Levant, or Dave Rubin, obvious, sort of like suckling to the Israel defense web types, and his transition from TYT to so-called right-wing media, that this is a very Israeli network too. This is a Russian-Israeli clean break culture war, information, covert empire of operations network.
And Lauren Chen from The Blaze and Glenn Beck is a perfect example of this, of a very Israeli-heavy partisan side of this clean break culture war. And yeah, Tim Pool, I'm starting to wrap up here, but Tim Pool, his wringing of hands of like, I can't believe, throwing his hands, I can't believe this would be of interest to them. And it's like, yeah, Tim Pool, yeah, it's a real shock that your talk of nonstop talk of the culture wars and of like, the splitting of America and the Civil War and the divisiveness being, that's being exploited upon by people who could benefit from it. I mean, it's a real shocker. It really isn't though, but I mean, it says a lot though. I think these people, and all the way from Dave Rubin to Lauren Southern and Ezra Levant to Lauren Chen and her connections, I think, with both The Blaze and with Turning Point USA, which are certainly key purveyors of this terror of the clean break culture wars. And so you go from Tim Pool to Ezra Levant to Glenn Beck and The Blaze, Charlie Kirk and Turning Point. Yeah, this is kind of a who's who of the clean break culture wars, as we call them. And if Tim Pool could be honest with himself, he would understand. I think he could start to put two and two together, but I get the sense he's not going to be.
Probably not. So we'll see as the pressure increases here, and there are questions about the amount of communications that might have been scooped up in this investigation about who all is potentially nervous in terms of what has not yet been revealed. Now, remember, this is the beginning of a revealing of what was alleged to be a covert network. Now, we had sussed it out with open source intelligence, and we couldn't say, okay, they're on the payroll per se, or we weren't claiming they were agents, but we were saying they were assets the whole time, And now it's almost, it's on the edge of being sort of officially proven out that they were assets. Now, witting or unwitting is not the question. You are an asset of these foreign powers for some reason. Now, figure out why. If that's anybody who's of good faith will begin to question why they became unwitting assets. And so my final 2 points as we end up here, Greg, is to also for folks to take a look at another revealed shutdown, a Department of Justice action against what was called the Doppelganger Network, which is hung around about 30 different sort of mimic websites that were set up straight out of the Kremlin, straight out of like Putin. One of Putin's deputies was managing these websites, but in this is a multi-hundred-page document that was released, and it includes all of the actual talking points. One of them was the good old USA project, and you really begin to see just like a lot of what we see very publicly and very overtly as part of a covert operation that's being run right out of the Kremlin. And a lot of it just mirrors GOP, sort of what have become the sort of GOP standard talking points, and how that then connects with these so-called alternative or a quote unquote independent media types. And then the final thing I'll say is then that there's interesting symbolism in terms of even the names of some of these folks. Like now, for example, one of the indicted Russians behind the Tenet Media covert information warfare operation is surnamed Kalashnikov. Okay. And previously we had an indictment of what was said to be the GOP, the House GOP's central witness on Hunter Biden laptop operation, Alexander Smirnov, right? So you're talking from versions of vodka to versions of machine guns, right? So this is a sort of one way for us to begin to think about these kinds of hostile information warfare networks, from alcohol and influence around alcohol and what that does. That's just a symbol. I'm just saying a symbol to sort of like actual, small arms that a militant group might use in terms of Kalashnikovs. So this is sort of, I think we're now getting a little bit more into the roots and the weeds. At least we're into the weeds. Maybe we're not yet at the roots. So some of what we've been uncovering here at the AnteDote for, more than half a decade.
Yeah, we're getting into the symbolism of things that people like Alex Jones's new arms dealing buddy, Victor Bout, were doing.
Yes, right.
All right. On that note, I think we will wrap up here, Jeremy, and thank you. And I'll try to mean it this time when I say we'll be back very soon, but we will be back soon.
Yes, we will. All right. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, everybody out there. We appreciate you. Until next time, AnteDote, we are out.